the reality is that at the border crossing of Rafah, between the south of the Gaza Strip and Egypt, there are many different trucks full of humanitarian aid, and many others can arrive, but they're really stuck there because there is no access to Gaza. And of course, this is for us pretty concerning because the humanitarian situation inside Gaza, as our colleagues of Palestine Red Crescent are saying, is catastrophic. Hospitals are running out of fuel, of medicine, of every supply, food and water. It's a big problem for the people in Gaza Strip. So there is a urgent need for humanitarian access and to bring much needed humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip.
So that humanitarian need, obviously, it kind of kicks in during a time of conflict or when these needs like right now are really critical. But are those channels open all the time? I mean, are these things that in time of peace are also being are these needs also being met by the IFRC in times of peace as well? And are these channels that are cut off in times of war, or are they created in times of need?
Well, I mean, we know that in the last more than the last decade, the access to Gaza has been from time to time complicated, and we also know that the humanitarian needs in Gaza were pretty high even before these last hostilities. Now, reality is that we were able, before the beginning of this last hostility, to bring humanitarian aid inside Gaza, and in fact, we prepositioned some humanitarian aid inside the Strip. That now, I mean, this humanitarian aid is of course depleted because of the large scale of violence that we are seeing in the last days. But since the beginning of the actual conflict, there was no access. So mainly the Gaza Strip is sealed. It's sealed to everyone. And of course, there is a big problem because we see, I mean, our teams are doing their utmost in the hospitals with doctors, nurses, ambulances. But then if they don't have any more medicine, or even worse, if they don't have any more electricity, as is the case in this very moment in Gaza, they will not be able to run ICU units, incubators, giving oxygen. So, of course, this is life-saving activities that can make the difference between death or life of many.
IFRC preparing for the situation to get even worse in Gaza, but also in other areas as well. I mean, how do you prepare for the worst or for a worsening of a situation when it's already really bad?
Well, this is a very interesting question. And of course, we are prepared to different scenarios. The reality is that I don't think that any one of us was prepared for such a large-scale conflict. And also, I mean, here there is a big issue of protection of civilians, innocent lives, of protection of doctors, nurses, hospitals, ambulances. So then our call to all the parties, it's really to respect international humanitarian law, to respect civilians, to respect health workers. Without security, without safety, we cannot do anything. So we can bring as much as we want humanitarian aid, technical people, more doctors at the borders of Gaza, but without safety, we are not able to do anything. So the call here is really to give safe and unhindered access to humanitarian aid, but also, of course, to respect civilians and to respect healthcare workers.
Right. So those things, having, guaranteeing access to aid and safety of humanitarian workers, I'm sure that falls under international law, right? I mean, where does international law stand on this? And how can the IFRC stick to international law or make international law be adhered to in the middle of a conflict?
Well, I mean, first of all, international. I mean, all the state parties of the Geneva Convention and the member states needs to stick to international humanitarian law. International humanitarian law stated clearly that civilians, in any condition, so to be clear, if they decide to evacuate from North Gaza or if they decide to leave, they don't leave, they need to be anyways respected and protected. Civilian infrastructure need to be respected and protected. Healthcare workers and facilities, meaning ambulances and hospitals, needs to be respected and protected. And this is really something that is written in the international humanitarian law. It's a legal obligation for all the parties in the conflict. And then, I mean, let me just add one thing. When in the international humanitarian law was written, it was written to give hope and light in the darkest moment of humankind. And armed conflict is the darkest moment. Even war has rules, and all the parties needs to remember that. If these rules are not respected, we will enter in a world that will be way worse than the world that we're living now.
Now, you mentioned civilian areas and civilian infrastructure needs to be protected. How do you define civilian infrastructure. I mean, I'm sure that is contested depending on who you ask, especially if you're asking an Israeli army person or somebody, a civilian in Gaza or a Hamas militant in Gaza. I mean, these are things that are used by everyone: roads, hospitals, school structures, right? But they're not always considered to be civilian if you ask different parties.
Well, I mean, even if I'm not an international humanitarian law legal expert, I know that, I mean, there are several infrastructure that are mentioned, like, for instance, bridges, schools, as you said, and buildings that are where people are taking shelter. I'm thinking about UN, the UNRWA buildings, and also our Palestine Red Crescent buildings that should not be touched. So, of course, I don't think that this is negotiable or is something that we can different opinions. If it is a place where people are taking refuge, if there is an hospital, these places need to be protected. I want just to give you an idea. In our two hospitals, I mean, Palestine Red Crescent Hospital in Gaza City and in Khan Yunis, more than 8,000 people seek refuge in the last days. Not patients, to be clear, just people who believes that hospital are the safest place where to stay. And this is, I mean, I think that is a clear reminder to everyone that there are rules and hospitals must be protected and respected.